On the morning of October 11, 1898, 3 surveyors employed by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway entered a stretch of the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona Territory with instructions to verify a proposed spur line route. Their names were recorded in the company ledger as Howard Prescott, age 32, chief surveyor, Martin Evers, age 28, assistant surveyor, and Thomas Ridley, age 24, chainman. None of them returned. The official inquiry, conducted 6 weeks later by territorial officials, determined that the men had deviated from their assigned route based on information from an unofficial source. That deviation, made on the second day of their survey, became the last confirmed decision any of them would make. Howard Prescott was not reckless by nature. His employment record with the railway, maintained in the company archives in Topeka, shows 14 completed surveys over 4 years without incident. He had worked in the Dakotas, eastern Colorado, and the Oklahoma Panhandle. His supervisor described him in a letter dated March 1897 as methodical to the point of tedium. Martin Evers had worked under Prescott for 18 months. Thomas Ridley was new to the position, hired in July of that year, but had previous experience with mining surveys in Nevada. They departed from Flagstaff on October 9th aboard a supply wagon driven by a local contractor named Samuel Booth. Booth's invoice, preserved in the railway files, lists the provisions: 70 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of salt pork, 12 pounds of coffee, 2 sacks of dried beans, matches, kerosene, 3 canvas tarps, survey equipment, including a transit theodolite, and 2 measuring chains. The wagon also carried 3 Winchester rifles and 200 rounds of ammunition, standard precaution for work in unincorporated territory. Booth returned to Flagstaff on the evening of October 10th after delivering the men to their starting point, a pine-covered plateau approximately 19 miles southeast of the town. His testimony to the inquiry describes the surveyors as prepared and in good spirits. The weather was clear. Temperatures were mild for the season. He noted no concerns. The assigned route followed a well-documented creek drainage that descended gradually toward the Verde Valley. The railway's interest was in determining whether the grade was suitable for freight traffic to serve timber operations and potential copper claims in the region. Prescott carried a departmental map marked with the proposed corridor. That map was never recovered. What is known comes from a journal kept by Martin Evers. The journal was found 4 years later, in 1902, by a sheepherder named Vicente Salazar, who discovered it wedged beneath a collapsed cairn of stones, approximately 8 miles from where the surveyors were last seen. The journal had been exposed to weather. Many pages were illegible, others had been torn out. What remained provided the only account of the decision that followed. The entry for October 11th, partially damaged but reconstructed by the inquiry, reads as follows: Morning clear. Began measurements along planned route. Encountered local man near mile marker 2. Claimed knowledge of old Spanish trace cutting southeast through ridge country. Says it reduces distance by half. HP examined his sketch. Discussed risks. Voted to investigate before committing equipment to full descent. The local man was never identified. No record exists of his name. Evers' description is minimal. Older, weather-worn, said he ran cattle in the area. The sketch he provided was not preserved. Whether it was carried into the wilderness or discarded at the decision point is unknown. Prescott's choice to investigate the shortcut was not recorded as firm commitment. Evers' phrasing suggests it was a reconnaissance, a temporary deviation to assess feasibility. The railway's later internal review noted that surveyors were granted discretionary authority to explore alternate routes if conditions warranted. Prescott had exercised such authority twice before without incident. At some point that morning, the 3 men left the established drainage and moved southeast into higher, more broken terrain. That direction is confirmed by the location where Evers' journal was eventually found. They carried their full equipment. They did not mark their departure point. They did not leave word with anyone in Flagstaff. The decision, in the moment it was made, likely seemed minor. The Mogollon Rim in 1898 was not entirely unmapped, but it was understood in fragments. The United States Geological Survey had conducted preliminary topographical work in the region during the 1880s, but coverage was incomplete. Surveyors working for private interests often relied on a patchwork of information: military reconnaissance notes, prospector accounts, cattlemen's verbal descriptions. Spanish colonial maps, some dating to the 18th century, occasionally surfaced in Tucson or Santa Fe, their accuracy uncertain. Railway surveyors of the period operated with an expectation of self-sufficiency. Company guidelines, reproduced in training manuals of the era, advised crews to carry provisions for twice the anticipated duration of work. Prescott's team had supplies for 2 weeks. The assigned survey was expected to take 6 days. This margin was considered adequate. Water availability was a central concern. The Mogollon Rim's southern face is characterized by intermittent streams that flow only during snowmelt or after monsoon rains. October falls outside both periods. Prescott would have known this. The planned route followed a perennial creek. The shortcut, as described by the unnamed local informant, allegedly tracked another drainage. Whether that drainage was seasonal or permanent would have been a critical question. Evers' journal does not address it. The terrain itself was familiar in type, if not in detail. Ponderosa pine forest transitioned to juniper and scrub oak at lower elevations. Rocky outcrops and ravines were common. Elevation changes were abrupt. Visibility was limited by vegetation and topography. Maps of the period show the area as largely blank, marked only with approximate contour lines and speculative labels. Howard Prescott's personal correspondence, recovered from his boarding house in Topeka after the inquiry, includes letters to his sister in Illinois. In one, dated August 1898, he writes, "The work is routine but requires attention. A man can lose his way in country that looks identical in all directions. I have learned to trust instruments over instinct." The letter suggests a cautious temperament. It also suggests awareness of the risks. The railway company's expectations were clear. Prescott's instructions, signed by the division engineer and filed in October 1898, specified the route, the timeline, and the requirement to submit a written report upon return. There was no mention of exploring alternatives, but neither was there explicit prohibition. The instructions assumed competence and granted operational latitude. Martin Evers, in earlier journal entries from the same expedition, recorded observations that indicate normalcy. On October 9th, weather holding fair. Equipment in good order, Ridley learning the work quickly. On October 10th, established camp near coordinates provided. Timber quality here is excellent. Grade appears manageable on first examination. There is no indication of conflict among the men. No suggestion of illness or equipment failure. No external pressure that would explain a hurried decision. The entry regarding the local informant appears in sequence with other mundane observations: dawn temperature, quality of coffee, condition of boots. The choice to investigate the shortcut emerges from the records as unremarkable in the moment. Surveyors regularly adjusted their approaches based on new information. Time saved was time that could be applied to more thorough measurement elsewhere. A reduction in distance, if real, would reflect well in Prescott's report. What the records do not explain is why Prescott did not mark his departure from the planned route. Standard practice, as outlined in railway survey protocols, required notation of all significant deviations, either in field journals or with physical markers. Evers' journal contains no mention of leaving a cairn or blaze marks on trees. No evidence of such markers was found during the search efforts that followed. One detail stands out in retrospect. Evers' entry for October 11th ends with a line that appears hasty, the handwriting less controlled than earlier passages. Country rougher than expected. Will reassess at high point. There is no entry for October 12th. The exact location where the surveyors left the planned route cannot be established with certainty. Subsequent search parties identified a likely departure zone based on the eventual discovery of Evers' journal, but the terrain had been traversed by cattle, wildlife, and other travelers in the intervening years. No definitive physical evidence marked the spot. What can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence is the sequence of choices that followed. The local informant's sketch, as described by Evers, indicated a route that ascended a ridge system before descending through a series of side canyons toward the Verde Valley. The appeal was straightforward. The planned railway route followed a longer, more circuitous path around the high country. A direct crossing would save mileage and potentially reveal a more favorable grade. Prescott would have weighed this against known risks. The high country was unfamiliar. Water sources were uncertain. The sketch came from an unverified source, but the informant was described as someone who ran cattle in the area, suggesting local knowledge. Cattlemen moved stock through the Mogollon Rim regularly, often using routes unknown to outsiders. The decision to proceed appears to have been gradual. Evers' phrasing, "voted to investigate," suggests discussion. Ridley, as the junior member, likely deferred to Prescott's judgment. Evers, as assistant surveyor, may have voiced caution or agreement. The journal does not specify. The physical act of moving southeast would have begun simply. The surveyors would have gathered their equipment, confirmed compass bearings, and begun walking. Ponderosa pine forests in the region are open at ground level, the understory sparse. Travel would have been relatively easy at first. The ridge system they sought would have been visible from a distance. The Mogollon Rim is not a single escarpment, but a series of uplifted plateaus, separated by drainages and faults. Navigating from one to another requires attention to topography. Prescott carried the theodolite, a precision instrument used to measure angles and elevations. He would have taken sightings as they moved, correlating observed features with the informant's sketch. At some point, likely within the first mile or two, the terrain became more difficult. Evers noted, country rougher than expected. This suggests obstacles: deadfall timber, rocky slopes, thickets of manzanita or oak. Progress would have slowed. The weight of the equipment became a factor. The theodolite alone weighed 40 pounds. The measuring chains added another 30. Provisions and personal gear distributed among 3 men still represented significant load. Water availability would have been assessed early. If the informant's sketch indicated a specific drainage, Prescott would have looked for it. October is a dry month. Streams that appear on maps drawn from spring observations often vanish by autumn. If the promised water source was absent, the surveyors faced a decision: turn back immediately or continue to the next potential source. Evers' journal mentions a high point where reassessment would occur. This suggests the surveyors committed to reaching an elevated vantage before making a final determination. In ridge country, such vantages are deceptive. What appears to be a summit from below often reveals itself as merely the shoulder of a higher rise. The next high point is always visible. The temptation to reach it, to gain the clarity it promises, is persistent. The entry ending with "will reassess at high point" was likely written in the afternoon of October 11th, possibly during a rest break. The light at that time of year begins to shift by 4 o'clock. Shadows lengthen, the air cools. If the surveyors were still climbing, still seeking that vantage, they would have been aware of diminishing daylight. What happened next is not recorded in any surviving document. The journal ends. No subsequent entries were made. No marks were left on trees. No cairns were built. The surveyors vanished into the sequence of ridges and canyons that defines the Mogollon Rim's broken topography. The inquiry later attempted to reconstruct possible routes. Using the location of the journal as a starting point, investigators traced sight lines and drainage patterns. They identified 3 likely paths the men might have taken, each leading into progressively more remote and difficult country. None of the paths led to water. All of them led away from established trails. One detail emerged from the physical examination of the journal itself. The final pages had been torn out. Whether this was done by Evers, by one of his companions, or by some later hand is unknown. The torn edges were weathered, suggesting exposure before the journal was wedged beneath the cairn. What those pages contained, if anything, cannot be known. A secondary detail, noted by Vicente Salazar when he discovered the journal, was the cairn's construction. It was not elaborate. A simple stack of flat stones, waist-high, positioned on a bare outcrop. Salazar, interviewed in 1903, said he initially thought it was a boundary marker of some kind. He disturbed it while investigating, and the journal fell loose from beneath the bottom stone. Someone built that cairn. Someone placed the journal there. Whether it was Evers, Prescott, Ridley, or another person entirely, and whether it was done deliberately or as an act of desperation, remains unclear. The last confirmed action by the surveyors, supported by physical evidence, was the writing of that final journal entry. Everything that followed exists only as absence. The railway company expected Prescott's team to return by October 17, 1898. When they did not, the division office in Topeka sent a telegram to the Flagstaff agent on October 19th, requesting confirmation of their status. The agent replied that the surveyors had not been seen since their departure with Samuel Booth on October 9th. Booth was questioned on October 21st. He confirmed delivery to the planned starting point and described the men as adequately provisioned. He stated that Prescott had given no indication of altering the assigned route. Booth offered to guide a search party to the drop-off location. The railway authorized this on October 23rd. The first search effort involved Booth and 2 local trackers, both experienced in the region. They followed the creek drainage that marked the planned survey route. They found no evidence of the surveyor's presence, no campsites, no marked trees, no surveying stakes. After 3 days, they returned to Flagstaff with no information. A second search was organized on November 1st, this time involving a larger party that included a deputy territorial marshal and 6 volunteers. The strategy was expanded. The group divided into pairs and searched a broader area, moving both along the planned route and into adjacent drainages. Weather had turned. Early snow fell on November 3rd, covering tracks and complicating visibility. The search was abandoned on November 6th. Prescott's sister in Illinois, upon learning of the disappearance, contacted the railway directly and demanded further action. The company agreed to fund a third search in the spring of 1899 after snowmelt. That search, conducted in late April, covered an even wider area. Searchers found remnants of old camps, but none could be definitively linked to the missing men. The search concluded on May 10th with no results. The railway's internal investigation, completed in June 1899, reviewed Prescott's instructions, the surveyor's qualifications, and the adequacy of their provisions. The investigator noted the absence of any physical evidence and the lack of witness testimony beyond Booth's account. The report concluded that the men had likely encountered an accident, a fall, a flash flood, exposure, but could not determine cause or location. The report recommended marking the men as deceased in company records. Families received death benefits. Prescott's sister contested the findings, arguing that without bodies, no definitive conclusion could be drawn. She hired a private investigator in 1900. That investigator traveled to Arizona and interviewed residents of Flagstaff, cattlemen, prospectors, and indigenous informants. He produced a report suggesting the men might have been victims of foul play, but provided no evidence. The railway dismissed the report as speculative. In 1902, Vicente Salazar found the journal. He did not immediately recognize its significance. He kept it for several weeks before mentioning it to a storekeeper in Camp Verde, who recognized the railway company's name written inside the front cover. Word reached Flagstaff. Territorial officials retrieved the journal and reopened the inquiry. The journal's location, 8 miles southeast of the planned route, confirmed that the surveyors had deviated significantly. A new search was organized, focused on the area surrounding the cairn. Searchers found nothing else. No equipment, no remains, no clothing. The terrain in that area consists of steep-walled canyons separated by narrow ridges. Vegetation is dense. Visibility is limited. Seasonal floods scour the canyon floors. Scavengers are numerous. The inquiry's final report, issued in December 1902, incorporated the journal evidence. It concluded that Prescott had made the decision to explore an alternate route based on information from an unidentified local source, that the route proved more difficult than anticipated, and that the surveyors became lost or incapacitated in remote country. The report noted that the decision to deviate, while within Prescott's discretionary authority, was made without adequate precaution or notification. No blame was formally assigned. The report described the outcome as a consequence of insufficient information and the unpredictable nature of wilderness travel. Prescott's sister rejected this conclusion. In a letter to the territorial governor dated January 1903, she wrote, "My brother was not careless. Something happened to those men beyond poor judgment. Someone knows what occurred and has remained silent. No response to that letter exists in the archives." The railway abandoned plans for the spur line in 1904. Timber operations in the region proved less profitable than anticipated. The Mogollon Rim remained largely undeveloped for decades. In 1961, a Forest Service crew conducting fire prevention surveys in the same general area reported finding fragments of rusted metal beneath a ledge overhang. The fragments were later examined by a historian researching the 1898 disappearance. They included a corroded transit theodolite frame, identifiable by its manufacturer's mark, a company that supplied railway surveyors in the 1890s. The discovery was made 11 miles south of where Evers' journal had been found, in a side canyon accessible only by difficult descent. No human remains were recovered at that site or any other. The theodolite fragment is housed in a small historical collection in Flagstaff. It is not on display. The unnamed local informant was never identified. Efforts to trace his identity through cattle brand records and property filings produced no results. If he existed, he left no mark in the documentary record. If he did not, if Prescott misunderstood or misremembered an encounter, if the sketch was imagined or fabricated, then the decision to deviate rests entirely on the surveyors themselves. Historians examining the case have noted that shortcuts, in the context of Western survey work, were not uncommon temptations. Time pressure, ambition, and the promise of efficiency all played roles. The difference between a calculated risk and a fatal error often appeared only in hindsight. What remains certain is the sequence. The surveyors were given a task. They were provided a route. They chose, for reasons that seemed sound at the time, to investigate an alternative. That investigation led them into country from which they did not return. Evers' final line, "We'll reassess at High Point," has been interpreted as evidence of continued caution, a sign that the men intended to evaluate and possibly retreat. But reassessment requires reaching the point of reassessment. In ridge country, that point recedes. Each summit reveals the next. The promise of clarity lies always just ahead. Howard Prescott was methodical to the point of tedium, according to his supervisor. Martin Evers kept a detailed journal. Thomas Ridley was new, but not inexperienced. None of them were reckless. None of them intended to disappear. The decision was made in good faith, in daylight, with available information. It was reversible until the moment it was not. Somewhere in the canyons and ridges southeast of Flagstaff, 3 men walked beyond the point of return. The exact moment when retreat became impossible, whether it was a matter of distance, exhaustion, injury, or disorientation, cannot be known. The country does not yield such details. What the records show is simpler. A choice was made, and it could not be unmade. The shortcut was marked on no map. No one returned.